Herbicide resistance. The $43 billion weed crisis destroying farm profits. For decades, American farmers relied on a simple promise. Spray the field, kill the weeds, protect the crop. It was efficient, it was predictable, and for a long time, it worked almost perfectly. In fact, when glyphosate-based herbicide programs became widely adopted across corn and soybean systems in the late 1990s and early 2000s, many agronomists believed weed control had finally entered a new era of simplicity. One pass, clean fields, reliable yields, and for nearly a decade, that promise held true. Fields that once required multiple herbicides, cultivation passes, and complicated management strategies suddenly became easy to control. Producers could simplify their programs. Equipment could move faster, and weed pressure seemed to collapse almost overnight. For farmers who had spent their careers battling pigweed, ragweed, lambsquarters, and foxtail, the system felt revolutionary. But biology rarely stays simple for long, because while farmers were eliminating weeds across millions of acres, something else was happening quietly inside those same fields. Evolution was at work. Every time an herbicide is sprayed across a field, it creates a powerful selection pressure. The majority of weeds die. The ones that survive pass their genetic traits forward. And if even a tiny fraction of the population carries natural tolerance to that herbicide, those plants suddenly gain an enormous advantage. They survive, they reproduce, and their seeds spread across the field. At first, the changes are invisible. The field still looks clean. The herbicide program still appears to work. Yields remain strong, and most producers assume the system is still doing exactly what it was designed to do. But under the surface, the weed population is slowly shifting. Year after year, spray after spray, season after season, the same chemistry is applied. The same weeds are exposed. And the same evolutionary pressure continues selecting the plants that can survive it. At first, it may only be one plant in a million. Then 1 in 100,000. Then 1 in 10,000. And eventually, the balance tips. Instead of rare survivors, the field begins to produce entire populations of weeds that no longer respond to the herbicide program that once controlled them effortlessly. This is how herbicide resistance begins. Not with a sudden catastrophe, but with a slow biological shift that most farmers never notice until it has already taken hold. Across the United States, that shift is now happening at a scale few people expected. According to multiple agricultural research estimates, herbicide-resistant weeds are now costing American agriculture more than $43 billion every year in lost yield, increased herbicide costs, additional labor, and mechanical control strategies. And that number continues to grow. But the real story behind herbicide resistance is not just the economic damage. It's the speed. In some regions, resistance that once took decades to develop is now appearing in less than 10 years. Entire weed populations are adapting faster than many herbicide programs can be redesigned. And nowhere is this problem more visible than in one particular group of weeds that has become infamous across American farmland. Pigweeds. More specifically, two species that have become some of the most aggressive and economically destructive weeds modern farmers face. Palmer amaranth and waterhemp. To someone unfamiliar with crop production, these weeds may look ordinary. A tall stem, broad leaves, fast growth, but to the farmers dealing with them, these plants represent something very different. They represent a system that is slowly slipping out of control. Palmer amaranth, in particular, has earned a reputation for growth rates that can exceed 3 inches per day under ideal conditions. In dense infestations, the plants can grow taller than soybean canopies and compete aggressively for sunlight, water, and nutrients. And the yield losses can be devastating. Research trials have shown that even relatively small Palmer amaranth populations can reduce soybean yields by more than 50% if left uncontrolled. But yield loss is only part of the problem. These weeds produce enormous numbers of seeds. A single Palmer amaranth plant can generate hundreds of thousands of seeds during one growing season. Those seeds can spread through combines, equipment, wind, water movement, and even contaminated crop seed. Once established, the weed population expands rapidly. Fields that had only a few scattered plants one year can become heavily infested within just a few growing seasons. And when those weeds carry herbicide resistance traits, the situation becomes far more complicated. Because now the problem is no longer just weed pressure. It becomes a chemical arms race. Producers respond by adding additional herbicides to their programs. Tank mixes become more complex. Application timings become tighter. Costs begin to rise. But sometimes, even those adjustments fail to regain control. In parts of the Midwest and southern United States, farmers are now dealing with Palmer amaranth populations resistant to multiple herbicide modes of action simultaneously. Glyphosate resistance, ALS resistance, PPO resistance. In some cases, even more. When weeds survive 3, 4, or even 5 different herbicide classes, the number of effective chemical options shrinks dramatically. And once that happens, every management decision becomes more difficult. Fields require more monitoring, spray programs require more planning, and mistakes become much more expensive. For many farmers, the realization hits during a moment that feels both familiar and unsettling. You spray the field, you wait several days, you drive back out to check the results. Most of the weeds are gone. But scattered across the field, a few plants remain standing. Green, healthy, unaffected. At first it looks like a simple application miss. Maybe the sprayer skipped a section. Maybe rainfall diluted the product. Maybe the weeds were simply too large. So the field is sprayed again. But the same plants survive. That is often the moment when a farmer first encounters herbicide resistance. And by the time it becomes visible, the weed population may already be spreading across the field. Because resistance rarely begins with a single plant. It usually begins with dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Across millions of acres of farmland, this quiet evolutionary shift is slowly reshaping the economics of crop production. Programs that once cost farmers $30 or $40 per acre may now require double that amount. Additional herbicides, residual chemistry, mechanical control, hand roguing in extreme cases. What once looked like a solved problem has quietly become one of the most expensive biological challenges modern agriculture faces. And the most uncomfortable part of the story is this. Many of these resistance problems did not emerge because farmers were careless. They emerged because the system encouraged simplicity. For years, the agricultural industry promoted herbicide programs that relied heavily on the same chemistry season after season. The strategy was efficient, easy to apply, and extremely effective in the short term. But over time, that consistency created the perfect environment for resistant weeds to evolve. Now the consequences are appearing across the landscape. And in the next part of this discussion, we need to look more closely at the two weeds that have become the most dangerous players in this entire crisis. Palmer amaranth and waterhemp. Because understanding how these plants grow, reproduce, and spread across farmland may be the key to understanding why herbicide resistance has become such a massive economic threat. The two weeds that changed modern farming. When farmers talk about herbicide resistance today, two weeds dominate almost every conversation. Palmer amaranth and waterhemp. Both belong to the same plant family. Both evolved in North America. And both have developed an ability to adapt to herbicide programs faster than almost any other agricultural weed. To understand why herbicide resistance has become such a large economic problem, it helps to understand what makes these two species so different from the weeds farmers battled 30 or 40 years ago. Because the truth is simple. These are not ordinary weeds. They are biological machines built for survival. Palmer amaranth, sometimes called Palmer pigweed, is native to the southwestern United States. For decades it existed mostly in warmer regions, particularly across states like Arizona, Texas, and parts of the southern plains. But over the last 20 years, it has spread aggressively across major agricultural regions of the country. Today, Palmer amaranth can be found throughout much of the Corn Belt, the Mid-South, and large areas of soybean and cotton production. One reason for this rapid expansion is its growth speed. Under ideal conditions, Palmer amaranth can grow several inches per day. That means a plant that emerges slightly earlier than the crop can quickly outcompete young soybeans or corn plants for sunlight. Within just a few weeks, it can rise above the crop canopy. Once that happens, the crop begins losing the competition for light. Yield loss starts almost immediately. But rapid growth is only part of the story. The real reason Palmer amaranth has become so dangerous is its reproductive power. Unlike many traditional weeds, Palmer amaranth is what scientists call a dioecious plant. That means individual plants are either male or female. They require cross-pollination to produce seed. From an evolutionary perspective, this creates enormous genetic diversity. Every time pollen moves between plants, new genetic combinations are created. That genetic diversity increases the odds that at least some individuals in the population will carry traits allowing them to survive herbicide applications. And once those survivors reproduce, the resistant genes spread rapidly across the field. One female Palmer amaranth plant can produce hundreds of thousands of seeds in a single growing season. Those seeds can remain viable in the soil and emerge over multiple years, creating what agronomists call a seed bank. Once that seed bank becomes established, controlling the weed becomes far more complicated. Even if a farmer manages to eliminate the visible plants in one season, thousands of dormant seeds may still be waiting beneath the soil surface. Each spring, a new wave of seedlings can emerge, and every one of them carries the potential to continue spreading herbicide resistance. Waterhemp, the other major player in this story, shares many of the same traits. Like Palmer amaranth, waterhemp is also a dioecious species. It produces enormous numbers of seeds and maintains extremely high genetic diversity within its populations. But waterhemp has one additional advantage that makes it particularly difficult to control. Its emergence window is long. Many weed species germinate within a narrow time frame early in the growing season. Once those weeds are controlled, the crop canopy eventually shades the soil and suppresses later emergence. Waterhemp behaves differently. Its seeds can germinate throughout a much longer portion of the growing season. This means farmers may successfully control the first wave of weeds with early herbicide applications, only to see new waterhemp seedlings emerge weeks later. By that point, crop canopies may already be closing. Spray windows become narrower, and the weeds that emerge late in the season often escape treatment entirely. Those surviving plants then mature and produce seed, which means the population grows larger the following year. This cycle is one reason waterhemp populations have expanded so rapidly across the Midwest. In many soybean systems today, agronomists consider waterhemp one of the most economically damaging weeds producers face. But the real challenge appears when herbicide resistance enters the picture. Over the last 2 decades, both Palmer amaranth and waterhemp have evolved resistance to multiple herbicide modes of action across many regions of the United States. Glyphosate resistance was one of the earliest and most widely documented cases. When glyphosate-resistant crops were first introduced, the herbicide became the backbone of weed control programs across millions of acres. It was effective, relatively inexpensive, and simple to apply, but repeated use created the exact selection pressure that evolutionary biology predicts. Within a few years, resistant populations began appearing. Farmers responded by introducing additional herbicide chemistries into their programs. For a while, that approach restored control. But the weeds continued adapting. ALS inhibitors lost effectiveness in many regions. PPO inhibitors began showing resistance cases as well. And in certain populations of waterhemp, researchers have now documented resistance to several herbicide groups simultaneously. Each time a weed population gains resistance to another herbicide class, the number of tools available to farmers becomes smaller. Spray programs grow more complicated, costs rise, and the margin for error shrinks. In severe infestations, producers sometimes find themselves in a situation where even well-designed herbicide programs struggle to regain control. Fields may require additional passes. Mechanical cultivation may return to systems that had largely abandoned it. In extreme cases, crews may even be hired to manually remove surviving plants before they set seed. For farmers who remember the simplicity of herbicide programs 20 years ago, the contrast can feel dramatic. What once seemed like a solved problem has become a constant management challenge. But the most important lesson in this entire story is that herbicide resistance did not develop overnight. It developed gradually, season by season, spray by spray. Each year the same herbicide program was repeated, the weed population was given another opportunity to adapt. And eventually, it did. Understanding that process is critical, because it reveals something many farmers rarely hear discussed openly. Resistance is not simply bad luck. It is a predictable biological response to repeated selection pressure, which means it can also be slowed, delayed, and sometimes prevented through better management strategies. But those strategies require a shift in thinking. Instead of relying on a single herbicide solution, weed management must become a system built on diversity. Different chemistries, different timings, different control methods working together. In the next part of this discussion, we need to examine exactly how herbicide resistance evolves at the biological level. Because once farmers understand how weeds adapt to chemical pressure, the path toward protecting their herbicide programs becomes much clearer. And without that understanding, the $43 billion weed crisis may continue growing faster than most people expect. How herbicide resistance actually develops. To understand how herbicide resistance spreads across farmland, it helps to step back and look at a simple biological principle. Nature is constantly testing survival. Every plant, every insect, every organism carries small genetic variations. Most of these variations have no noticeable effect, but occasionally, a mutation gives an individual plant a slight advantage under specific environmental conditions. When herbicides enter the system, they become a powerful environmental filter. Think of an herbicide application as a selection event. When a field is sprayed, the vast majority of weeds die. But if even a few plants carry a genetic trait that allows them to tolerate the herbicide, those plants survive. They continue growing, they flower, they produce seeds. Those seeds then become part of the soil seed bank. The following season, some of those seeds germinate. If the same herbicide is applied again, the process repeats itself. Sensitive plants die, tolerant plants survive, and each year, the proportion of resistant individuals in the population slowly increases. At first, the change is almost impossible to detect. A field might contain millions of weeds, and only a handful may carry resistance genes. The herbicide program still appears effective because nearly all the plants are controlled. But evolution does not need large numbers to begin working. It only needs survivors. Over time, those survivors reproduce and spread their traits across the population. After several growing seasons, the resistant plants are no longer rare. They become a noticeable percentage of the weeds emerging in the field. And eventually, they become the dominant population. At that point, the herbicide program that once worked reliably begins to fail. What farmers often see in the field is a patch of weeds that seem unaffected by the spray program. The rest of the field appears controlled, but certain areas remain green. Those patches may contain thousands of plants that all descended from the same resistant ancestor. Because weeds like Palmer amaranth and Waterhemp cross-pollinate, the resistance traits can spread even faster. Pollen can move between plants across considerable distances. When a resistant plant pollinates a susceptible plant, the offspring may inherit the resistance trait. Within a few seasons, entire populations can carry the genetic ability to survive the herbicide. And once that trait becomes common, reversing the process becomes extremely difficult. This is why agronomists often say that resistance management is far easier to prevent than to fix. Once a resistant population is established, farmers must change strategies quickly to prevent the problem from expanding across the entire farm. Another factor that accelerates resistance development is repeated exposure to the same herbicide mode of action. Different herbicides kill weeds in different ways. Some interfere with amino acid production. Others disrupt photosynthesis. Some prevent cell division. Each mechanism targets a specific biological process inside the plant. When the same mode of action is used repeatedly across multiple seasons, weeds are exposed to the exact same biological pressure every year. From an evolutionary standpoint, that creates a predictable outcome. Plants that carry mutations protecting that biological pathway survive. All others die. If the same herbicide continues to be used season after season, the resistant plants gradually dominate the field. In the early years of glyphosate-based systems, many farmers relied heavily on a single herbicide mode of action. The product was effective, affordable, and extremely easy to use. But that convenience created one of the largest selection pressures agriculture had ever seen. Millions of acres were treated with the same chemistry every season. Weeds across the country were exposed to identical biological pressure. And over time, evolution responded exactly as expected. Glyphosate-resistant populations began appearing in multiple species. First in small patches, then across entire fields, and eventually across entire regions. Once resistance begins spreading, farmers often attempt to regain control by adding additional herbicides to the program. Tank mixes become more common. Residual products are introduced earlier in the season. Pre-emergence and post-emergence applications are combined. These adjustments can slow the spread of resistant weeds when implemented correctly. But if herbicide diversity is still limited, the weeds may eventually adapt again. Waterhemp populations in some regions have now developed resistance to multiple herbicide groups simultaneously. This type of resistance creates an extremely difficult management challenge. Each time a herbicide loses effectiveness, the remaining options become more valuable. And that is where many weed management systems reach a dangerous tipping point. If too few herbicide modes of action remain effective, farmers may be forced to rely repeatedly on the same limited set of products. That situation recreates the same evolutionary pressure that caused the resistance problem in the first place. Which means the cycle begins again. This is why modern weed management can no longer rely on herbicides alone. Chemical control remains an important tool, but without diversity in management practices, herbicides eventually lose effectiveness. The farms that are successfully slowing resistance today are often the ones combining multiple strategies. Rotating herbicide modes of action, using residual chemistry to prevent early weed establishment, managing weed escapes before they produce seed, and integrating additional cultural practices that reduce weed pressure before herbicides are even applied. Because in the end, herbicide resistance is not simply a chemical problem. It is an ecological problem. It is the natural result of applying a single control method repeatedly across large landscapes. And once that pattern is broken, the system begins to change again. In the next part of this discussion, we will look at the management strategies that researchers and experienced agronomists now consider essential for protecting herbicide programs. Because despite the scale of the resistance problem, there are still proven ways to slow its spread. But those solutions require farmers to think about weed control very differently than they did 20 years ago. Herbicide resistance didn't appear overnight. It developed slowly, season after season, as the same solutions were used again and again. And today, across millions of acres, farmers are seeing the result. Weeds that no longer respond to programs that once worked perfectly. But the future of weed control isn't hopeless. With better planning, diversified herbicide programs, and integrated management strategies, it is still possible to slow resistance and protect the productivity of your fields. Because in the end, weed control isn't just about this year's crop. It's about protecting the land for the years that follow. If this video helped clarify the real story behind herbicide resistance, consider subscribing to the channel for more practical agronomy insights that affect real farm decisions every season. Corn.